Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Cooper Union School of Architecture's lecture series. I'm Noura Akawi, a faculty member at Cooper, and I have the pleasure of introducing today's lecture. Before I start, I want to remind everyone that on Thursday, October 14, there's another lecture also in the Great Hall at 6:30 by TJ Gottsteiner. I have the unique pleasure of welcoming today's guest, Miguel Robles-Duran, and also we're very lucky to have Eva Franch and Gilabert joining Miguel for a conversation after this talk. Thank you both. I want to welcome also everyone who's joining us via Zoom and all of the students and the faculty who are here in the room. This is a second of a series entitled Pluriversal, Bewildered and Otherwise on Thinking and Practicing Architecture Otherwise. The series spans across the 2 semesters this year. Cohabitation Strategies, please come. Cohabitation Strategies, Urban Front was invited as one of the architecture collectives. I don't know if they would define themselves in these terms. One of the architecture collectives, cooperatives, publishers, researchers, or organizers whose work is rooted in social movements for freedom and justice, who refuse architecture as a tool or service for colonial and capitalist extraction, and paves paths towards exiting its current disciplinary, professionalized, and individualized systems. Upcoming talks as part of this series include Sigil Collective on October 26, based in Syria and Lebanon, and African Mobilities, represented by Mpomatsipa on November 16. All of these are on Tuesdays at 12. I want to give a shout out also to Radio El Hara, a radio based out of Bethlehem, who are broadcasting the lecture to their listeners all over the world. So thank you. Miguel Robles-Duran is an urbanist with expertise in urban political ecology and the design and analysis of complex urban systems. He's Associate Professor of Urbanism at Parsons School of Design, where he founded the Urban Ecologies graduate program, which has been a reference for all of us interested in advancing transformative approaches to pedagogies relating to the built environment. Miguel is a founding member of Urban Front, together with David Harvey, Laura Rajkovic, Ola Hassanyan, and many others. And that's a transnational consultancy focused on helping progressive public and social sectors address critical urban issues, including housing, environmental justice, public health, cultural action, sustainable infrastructure, and political strategy. He's also the co-founder of Cohabitation Strategies, a Rotterdam and New York City-based nonprofit cooperative committed to radical socio-spatial research, design, and development. They have been for 13 years developing and designing over a dozen urban projects in Europe, North and South America, centered on the development of original action research methodologies, transdisciplinary frameworks, neighborhood-based initiatives, and the facilitation of community-driven transformative interventions against neoliberal urbanization. He's a contributing member of Democracy at Work, where he hosts the Cities After ... an anti-capitalist bi-weekly podcast about the future of cities. In previous years, he co-directed with David Harvey the National Center for the Right to the Territory in the Republic of Ecuador. His work has been exhibited in many venues around the world, including MoMA, the MAC Museum in Vienna, and almost all of the architecture biennials and triennials I can think of, including the Venice Biennale of Architecture, where their work is currently on show. Directly after this talk, Miguel will be joined by the one and only Eva Franch and Gilabert. As I mentioned earlier, Eva is currently teaching at the Cooper Union. She's the former director of the Architectural Association School of Architecture in London and was the chief curator and executive director of the Storefront for Art and Architecture in New York and the co-curator of the US Pavilion at the 2014 Venice Architecture Biennale. Her work articulates global desires with local understandings, with an interest in new architecture histories and potential futures, and specializes in curatorial activism and planetary pedagogies and practices. I couldn't think of anyone better to have this conversation with Miguel after the lecture. Thank you so much, both, and I'll leave it at that.
I just put it there. Thank you, Nora. Thank you all very much. Thank you for coming here. This is like super exciting for me to be here, simply because the first time I give a talk after the, during, I guess, the pandemic, but not yet there. And I, believe it or not, I always find so much pleasure in doing this simply because I get to talk and hear say all these kind of like contradictions that you will hear today. and that I hope that at least would cause some stir, and we can have a nice discussion right after. I want to really thank Nora. You've been absolutely amazing, and it's also amazing to have Eva do these. I think it is, yeah, it's just wonderful, and to be also here. I just come also from I don't know why this is not working. I can? I just received the positive test to the negative test. I get tested every week, yeah, much better. So yeah, today I received a negative test. I haven't seen anyone except Nora, so yeah, well, so I'll leave it there. Thank you very much. It's much more comfortable. So I was saying that I'm super excited to this talk. It's also a very new talk. I've never, I just put a series of videos together to explain mostly a transition between cohabitation strategies, which was the previous practice I had, and what prompted cohabitation strategies to be to exist, and then how that transition agenda today, which is that we have, which is urban front, and the questions that we are trying to answer and to continue to ask ourselves. And so today is going to be a little bit of a historical going back into how everything started, what prompted, what influenced us, and then part of those influences, I guess, we're going to be talking on discussions as we go. So in September 15, 2008, I was sitting in an outdoor bench in Giardino di Castello in Venice, and it was the Venice Biennial Architecture, 2008. My very old friend, Teddy Cruz, the architect from San Diego. I was raised in the border between San Diego and Tijuana. I was raised, Mexican, so Mexico-Tijuana. And we knew each other for some time. And both of us were very tired at that time when we were sitting in the Giardini, and because we were installing a few pieces. I mean, I was participating or doing a piece at the Dutch Pavilion. At that time, I was living in the Netherlands. Teddy was doing precisely this that I'm showing right now, which is his a very famous sort of covering of the American Pavilion of the Tijuana border, Tijuana wall. This was before Trump discussed walls or anything of that. And we're like just sitting there. And we had just also come back from visit to this other hall that is called the Arsenale, right? And the Arsenale, for those of you that don't know what the hell that is, it was, which I assume the majority, I mean, like, the Arsenale it's an ex-military building complex that was repurposed in 1999, so not that long ago, to accommodate rapidly growing Venice Biennial, right? And they needed more space to exhibit. And it is composed of like different structures, and including a 360-meter long building, so it's like 1,000 feet long building of uninterrupted interior space. So you can go through one axe to the other, and that has been used by the biennial curators to showcase the latest propositions. This is where the international exhibit happens, and normally it's the most recognized names in the art world or the architecture world, depending on which biennial you go in there. In 2008, there was a curated spectacle that was like no other I had ever seen before. I think it had become sort of that confluence or consecration of in a single point in space in this hall of a particular breed of superstar architects, and obviously their ideological regime, and they were obviously perfectly represented in these countless 3D models, life-size follies, and 2D projections, virtual reality displays, and assisted computer renders, and all these kinds of lighting arrangements that you could imagine happening at. And it was like a super extravaganza, right? So we were just coming there, we're sitting in this Giardini, looking at this, actually looking at his wall. And so by then the Arsenale had turned into a container of like the purest material representation of the architecture establishment, according to what I think it is. And I'm looking at this. And so we were completely dazed about what was going on and what was happening there. But at the same time, I received a text while I was sitting there saying that Lehman Brothers had collapsed. And I don't know why this is not moving. Let me do it again. here it is. So what does this mean for that day, at least for me? It was looking at a state of the world that was not reflected at that exhibit, right? It was looking at 35 years of an advancement of a type of agenda that came out of capitalism. It was called neoliberalism. And that I had put a lot of effort in understanding before. I published a book that's called Studies and Projects on Neoliberal Urbanization back in 2011. And I had been looking at many other things before that about neoliberalism's impact and so forth. And it almost seemed like a complete disjunction, right? I mean, on one hand, I was there in the Venice Biennial with all of these architects just like showcasing the most glamorous things. Okay? But at the same time, we had the beginning of an absolute collapse where people lost their lives through suicide, people lost their homes, their livelihoods, their jobs, and so forth. And basically, very little of that was reflected in that exhibit, right? And according to Teddy and myself, I mean, we're discussing that bench, and it was just simply something we could not get. Now, at the same time, of course, we have seen enormous profusion, or we saw enormous profusion of foreclosures, of protests, of issues of homelessness that have come out of the repercussions, basically, of that crisis. And in these senses of homelessness and foreclosures that this financial crisis triggered, it was, for us, at least, obvious that the built environment had a lot to do with it. And that architects were very much implicated and had a lot to do with everything that was happening there. Because as my friend David Harry always says, is that capital always looks for places for it to grow and to invest. And when there's a surplus accumulation, moments of surplus accumulation, capital normally relies on the built environment to consume that surplus, right? And we were seeing basically, we're arriving to a point of 35 years or 37 years of neoliberalism in which that surplus was there, bubbles were created, and then suddenly we have what I see is like around the world mass protests and everything. But going back to the biennial, I found this footage. So the biennial, we were like this. We were based from fest of architectural objects that were luxurious for mostly global elites. We were bewildered by the jubilee of unsustainable designs for our environment and absolutely stunned with the complete lack of affordable and urgent propositions for the majority of the people. In this case, the 99%, because we had the Occupy Wall Street hadn't existed yet, right? And having all these feelings while the global economy was collapsing, looking at these while the global economy was collapsing, in direct response to the reckless production of the built environment. And all that reckless production was being glorified at that exhibit that time. So in my mind, the connection could have not been that clear, right? The global architectural establishment had to share, in my mind, a bit of blame for this dramatic economic collapse. More so the members that profited from the most privatized and financed charade that neoliberal urbanization demanded, which were the superstar architects. And so, sorry to say, to mention names, but I think it's very important. I mean, Rem Koolhaas, Rem Gehry, Zaha Hadid, Peter Eisman, I know he teaches here, Santiago Calatrava, Elizabeth Biller, we have had talks, Herzog, Vinnie Maas, and so forth. All of the likes of the architectural superstars displayed at that exhibition, in my view, were implicated in the operations that led to this 2008 financial collapse. And not only that, but the dire social consequences that resulted from it. So even though by that time my work was already centered against the complacency of architects, that Monday, September 2008, became the day of my final disenchantment with the architecture discipline at large. So next part, I'm going to be talking about what I call the futility of architecture and the futility of architectural discipline. So despite all of these things that we saw, I think that the 20th century had seen, for at least a very brief period of time, the idea that states guaranteed a large portion of urban land at the control of public entities, which is the welfare state, and in general benefiting society at large. I think that many of these issues were swayed by many arguments in the 19th and 20th centuries that took place with Joseph Proudhon, the ideas of property theft, Karl Marx, obviously, Mikhail Bakunin, and many of the like, who together with massive social movements, because there were massive social movements that all of these things triggered, as we know, they pushed many states to experiment with other forms of land tenure and private property. Now, this is defined by the appearance of many variations of housing cooperatives, living communes, squatting collectives, common spaces, public land that was reserved for the enjoyment by all of us citizens alike. And under these political conditions, architecture, and this is a very important point I want to make today, architecture, planning, and all the derivative urban disciplines were at last beginning to contribute to the restructuring of space that benefited most members of society. At least this is what was the belief, right? That in sharp contrast with the previous centuries where the purpose of these experts, I'm talking the architects and whatever planners existed, was to serve the will and desires of the landed elites. So yes, there was a very short time where the proliferation of urban disciplines and the traditional services made total sense, and most importantly, made social sense. Democratic societies were envisioning commonwealth projects that trained technicians, architects, to use their skills to help materialize the demands of the society to the best disciplinary capacities available. Now, progressively, a large number of architects and planners at that time began to design spaces commissioned in the name of public good. Ethically, there was very little to question with this type of social commissions. Architects were very happy to do this, which demanded no less than them envisioning never-seen forms of public housing, of schools, of hospitals, of cultural spaces, of community centers, of transportation networks, and recreational infrastructures. The urban professionals that were actively taking part in these state-driven projects had very little reason to move outside the traits imposed by disciplinary boundaries, meaning the architect as an architect was doing the social cause, right? There was no need to go outside of architecture. You were doing your job to benefit society at large. Public entities were taking care of structuring economic and political social processes that were needed to develop and manage and sustain such projects. In short, the production of just urbanity demanded the design and coordination of incredibly complex processes where the architect or planner played a singular specific role in giving form to them and, of course, shaping ideas of what this should be. There was, at that time, for that very short time, a very clear social relevance in the tradition of architecture, these four urban disciplines. And it was a very brief period that didn't last. So as the early 20th century ideals gradually morphed into the consolidation of the neoliberal project, as you all know, with the selection of Margaret Thatcher as the Prime Minister of the UK in 1979, and of course in 1981, Ronald Reagan, the active role of architecture that used to be in that period retroceded into its original purposes, which is the representation of elitist power and a set of knowledge that effectively aided in the concentration of individual wealth. So the complex array of bureaucrats and public professionals that once designed and coordinated the political processes that supported social property slowly gave way to the neoliberal in its need to extract private rent from everything where human sweat was involved. This meant that... It's fine? Connected. Okay. This meant that private property needed to re-emphasize as the urban principle of economic growth. New political and financial instruments that could liberate public property from public housing and give it to speculative trade had to be designed and implemented, and very importantly, all the previous intents of securing urban land for general social well-being were disregarded, inefficient, and producers of damaging public debt. Many states had succeeded in this transition and others continue in the slow pace, but almost by now, all the world, as we know, one way or another, has been promoted this kind of speculation, which was made possible by this reenactment of private property as a main engine of economic growth. So neoliberal conglomerates, commonly private banks, investment funds, public-private partnerships, all of them needed trendy, glossy architects and trendy, glossy architecture that could give spectacular form to their visions, attract multinational capital as well as support for easy global capital to absorb all the surplus that was being generated. And many of the reforms on the private assets were part of this global financial roulette that played with architecture things that we see in the past. So circle around this. This is where cohabitation strategies began. Now, I don't mean that you, to accept that all of you agree with this point of view, how I look at architecture, but it's certainly the way that we looked at it when we started cohabitation strategies. We were completely tired and sick, and we didn't want to be part of that established sort of source. And we knew it was very difficult to fight it from within. So we decided to start to merge in the peripheries. And in those peripheries, was actually a very, very complicated sort of project for us. What you see here on the back displayed, it's a series, it's one project actually we did in the city of Milan as Qualitation Strategies, where our intention at that time was to disconnect architecture from the production of those elites and bring it back into what we thought, and we still think to a certain extent, was the grassroots. We were developing a lot of community projects, and this is since 2008. This project that we see here, I think it was 2011 or 2014, I don't remember very well, in which we're trying to connect with citizens in need and support their causes or bring intelligence so that they could live in a better condition, or that they could advocate against displacement or advocate against developers that were destroying their livelihoods and environments as they were developers and these people were advancing in their neoliberal frame. So for a bit around what would be 12 years, we produced 14 projects, mostly in Europe, South America, and North America, including Canada and the United States. Strangely enough, never in Mexico, even though two of the members, one of them, Gabriela, is there, were both Mexicans, but that never happened. We produced a series of projects in which included a lot of community organizing. We used participatory methodologies, specifically brought out by the Latin American perspective on action research, which is Orlando Falsborda and so on. And we just decided that to focus on a project that would be more anti-neoliberal, anti-development, anti-privatization. And the way to do it at that point, we believed, was through the bottom up. I want you to get that also very importantly. Kind of a shift started to happen back in 2014, was 14, yes, when myself and David Harvey, or should I say David Harvey and myself, were invited by the president of Ecuador, at that time, Rafael Correa, which had a very progressive leftist agenda, especially on the ecological front, to create a new research center that would look at the way capitalism is eating territory away from Ecuador, from the city. David and myself went to Ecuador and structured that center. It was called CENEDET, Centro Nacional de Estrategia para el Derecho al Territorio, a little bit building on this idea of the right to the city that David Harvey had. We pushed it up into the idea of the right to the territory. And the whole purpose of this center was to research uneven development that was produced by capitalist forces in Ecuador. It was never an attempt to bring another form of development. It was to analyze how uneven development happened with the different policies that Rafael Correa was trying to put there. The project lasted, the center lasted for 3 years. We had quite a number of projects working from the Amazon extraction, working from the cacao, chains of cacao beans. We looked at issues of flowers, the flower markets, because I don't know if you know that Ecuador is one of the largest, if not the second largest exporter of flowers in the world after the Netherlands and so forth, right? And we were looking at many issues that dealt with the transformation of territory. But one thing happened in my mind while I was working with David in this project. Imagine like teaching here, and was there for a week or so. It was a crazy time of my life. But I learned one thing, which was that the type of work that we were doing in Senedet had more influence in distorting or managing to transform the territory that the 12 years or 11 years that Cohabitation Strategies had been working on and trying to do. One thing that working at that level with the president of a country, with the different ministers of different countries, because we started to work with other countries alike and so on, is that there was so much political decision and political power that our influence, our mediatic influence, was much stronger than everything that Cohabitation Strategies was doing. Meaning, working with people, working with, trying to sort of do the bottom-up type of agenda, right? Because we have entered into a crux with Cohabitation Strategies, and that was that the idea that most of the things that we were doing were very difficultly being implemented, because there was something that was not pairing well. In short, one thing that David and myself realized at that point is that after 11 years of trying work for an anti-neoliberal thing, we understood that it's very inefficient. Not because it's not necessary to do the bottom-up work, it's because you have all of these laws and regulations, right? All of these governance structures, all of these finance mechanisms, taxation structures that do not permit the bottom-up to thrive. And then no matter how many processes we could have designed or worked together with people to go against neoliberal capital, we would have already been thwarted or stopped, because it gets to a moment that it cannot continue. An example was a project we did in Philadelphia with the city of Philadelphia, where we were structuring a land bank. The land bank happened, and when the land bank happened, most of the property were already earmarked to New York developers and so on, right? And so the structures that neoliberalism had put there, in our view, were the ones that first had to be dismantled or eroded before we even started thinking about the bottom-up, although I have to say the bottom-up continues to be a very important. So at that point, we decided to stop the work of. And strangely enough, it has not, because we were just asked to do this exhibit at the biennial and so forth and so on. But we decided to move to something else, which was Urban Front and unitary urbanism. In short, Urban Front, which is the new project, is the opposite of Cohabitation Strategies in a way that we structure a disciplinary form of practice, or a transdisciplinary form of practice, in which we take the top-down as our primary source of inspiration. Now, how that top-down works is what I'm about to actually talk a bit on these 11 points. And so, why I have to double-click this?
I don't know, but now I'm trying to accomplish more than I need to in the time that I have left. Okay. I love you too. All right, goodbye.
I double-clicked. How do I return to the previous? Yeah, okay, sorry. Yeah. So Urban Front became an idea to structure an international consultancy firm for the left. We tend to joke ourselves to call ourselves the McKinsey of the left, or we want to be the McKinsey of the left, right? And this is having a very simple understanding. The consultancy, the work of consultants actually began with neoliberalism. Neoliberalism had to carve citizen experts or experts working in government, have to take them away and replace them with private consultants, right? We used to have big departments of the city, and now we have very slimmed down departments of the city because most of the intelligence is coming from the private side. Basically, the welfare state was eroded to a point where you need private consultants to work on that. So understanding that principle, we thought that the best way to practice today, right, at least on issues of the city, was to come and take over that space that was carved by neoliberal capital, which was the consultancy space. Now, because we have had a lot of experience working with governments by then, right, with different governments around the world, we had a way into progressive government politics. And it was very important for us, or it continues to be very important for us, to insert ourselves as urban practitioners within the government, progressive government politics. We also became very influenced at that time. We started to discuss a lot with Barcelona en Común, which was that Ada Colau at that period was seen as a very progressive mayor. And many people from Barcelona were also taking part of this project, right? When we learned that Barcelona or Ada Colau was actually hiring McKinsey to do their consultancy, because there's basically, or there was no other choice but to hire McKinsey, because there's no idea of a progressive consultancy does not exist. So under this frame, we started this project, and I'm going to talk a little bit about this project and the fundamental 11 points in which we base ourselves. The first situation for us is that we have an anti-capitalist ethos. And this means that the fundamental social and environmental problems of today's urbanization, we see them as a product of a dominant dogma that promotes endless growth and concentration into the hands of the few. We cannot confront these problems without defying the dominant process that give rise to them. So Urban Front seeks to confront its causes with progressive's anti-capitalist approach. The aim of Urban Front basically is to radically rethink, redesign, and transform urban life towards the amelioration and ultimate eradication of structural, social, cultural, economic, political, and environmental inequities. Our second point is dialectical and transdisciplinarity. As I was saying in my dissolution with the architectural discipline, I think the architectural discipline as a discipline had its purpose under the welfare state apparatus, but I find it today quite futile. And so therefore, we structure ourselves as a dialectical and transdisciplinary organization. We believe that the urban problems of today cannot be approached within a single disciplinary or theoretical framework, which is what we still teach at universities and things alike. So the objective of Urban Front is to blur the knowledge silos for designing relational forms of acting, transdisciplinary knowledge structures, dialectical organizations, grassroots, historical and geographical materialist processes for social spatial transformation. Now, I want to put an emphasis here on one thing. I'm not talking about multidisciplinarity, which is very clear, like we're different disciplinary apparatuses, each of us looking at each other within its own frame. I'm not talking here about interdisciplinarity, which is what architects tend to do. They ask consultants from different fields, but architecture still has like the dominant form. We were talking here about the blurring, which goes closer to the idea of transdisciplinarity, where no discipline itself is better or more important than the other, where all disciplines are trying to blur each own disciplinary lines in order to get to a point where we can no longer see if we're acting as architects or anthropologists or geographers or whatever other disciplinary apparatuses we need to do. What you see here in the back are the different individuals that compose Urban Front. Gabriela is back there, which are at the moment 23 members from different continents, each of them coming from very different disciplinary frames, to the point where we don't even discuss ourselves from being disciplinary, right? And so part of our attempt to overdo, underdo, or like redo this neoliberal frame is that to rescue the general, which I know it's very problematic, right? For many years, we have become experts in specificity. What capitalism demands is expertise. What we're right now offering is more a general unitary view of urbanization as a production, where there is no expertise, but it's a confluence of different knowledges and opinion that come together in a relational aspect. Another very important point for us was that even though we tried, and we're going to try to work from the top-down structure, the empowerment of an organized population continues to be foundational for any approach that we take. The embeddedness to political action within social movements is axiomatic, because what we're doing from top down is to be able to erode the structures to support these social movements. So we are committed to cultivate relationships with a popular base of governments, democratic elected governments, of course, elected officials, neighborhood, cultural organizations, labor issues, urban social movements, basically all the social organization that we see today that struggles for a better living, but most importantly, that struggles for a better kind of anti-capitalist approach. Let's see if that moves. A fourth point for us is a very important aspect as a class I was just teaching now, which is the cultivation of an unalienated relationship to nature. What I mean by this is that it's essential. We all know that this cultivation of unalienated relation to nature is essential for survival. We know that the temperatures of the globe are going up, the toxicity in the environment are on the rise, that there's heavy pollution wrecking the inequalities of air, water, soil, threatening every aspect of life that is out there. We have increasing problems with waste disposal, loss of habitat, deterioration of the food supply, deforestation, and severe droughts that need to be critically confronted. And for us, this is where the politics of negation and affirmative ecological politics take precedence. So we are definitely pledging, or we are been working to develop knowledge, strategies, and tactics to support urbanization in the essential role to recuperate the health of our planet. And this for sure has nothing to do with the current forms that architecture takes. Also, we cannot imagine a better future if equity and justice of gender and race are not first achieved. Inequalities related to social reproduction and representations of globally manifest in the obviously low remuneration, diminished participation in politics, labor markets, access to medical care, education and training of women, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and persons with any skin color that it's not white. One of the primary objectives that we want to pursue is the design and implementation of intersectional structures that support the broadest possible range of identities. Organized is very important for us in opposition to imposed ideological forms of a single race or gender. Another very important aspect of our work has to do with equating knowledge. What we mean by equating knowledge is very important, is that for decades, if not centuries, people's knowledge has not been taken into account as equal as academic knowledge. I struggled at the New School when I arrived here to hire people that didn't have a proper academic degree because they were not allowed to teach at the university. Right at the moment, I'm structuring with different activists here from New York, for example, seminar structures where activist knowledge is taken at the same level as academic knowledge. And bringing this activist knowledge, this knowledge from the ground up for the same level became a very important, and it is a very important aspect of our work. This was one of the key things that we discussed in Ecuador, but that was very complicated for David Harvey and ourselves. As a matter of fact, we reached a dead point which we couldn't advance. We tried to hire people that were working in rural areas that didn't have a college degree, but that had decades of experience working in cooperative farming, right? Just because that's what they thought they should do. And they had so much knowledge to give. But the university structure, the research center structure that we had in Ecuador prohibited them to teach with us. And so we had to structure seminars out in the rural areas, right? Not bringing them here, but bringing us back. And it created a lot of problems, even in those structures that are allowed. So we believe, and we have to plea that it is very important, right, to begin to acknowledge that other knowledges, especially when we're talking about an anti-capitalist agenda, are much more important than our knowledges. Now, AI, very contentious part also. Now, what I'm talking about here with AI is that new technological advancements have the potential to ease the burden of exploitative human labor and free time for everyone to pursue their passions. And by doing so, demand the creation of new urban spaces that are truly emancipatory, that there's a different kind of human interaction. And we insist that the existing or forthcoming technologies have to be repurposed primarily for the production of social good, which is obviously what is not happening. Technology right now is at the service of capital, and technology is replacing humans, not for social good, but for slavery, toil, and so on. And again, urbanization and new buildings have a lot to do with this frame. Democracy requires the construction of mechanisms that share decision-making power and resources with coordinated forms of public or popular administration. This has been a principle that has been pushed a lot by our colleagues from Barcelona, where they have been working with an agenda that say, instead of giving public resources to private organizations, the next trend is to give public resources to communitarian projects. So let me put this in perspective. If we see the welfare state as the first stage of these, which is the state decides over the state where to give the money, the surplus, or the fiscal, or the taxes, right? And it has a patriarchal relationship to how to distribute the good for everyone. We enter then to the neoliberal frame, which is the absolute opposite. The money gets distributed to private entities to profit from. We believe that the third wave, or the next wave, has to be to invest in distributing resources to collectives or to communitarian participation, and to let them decide over what to do. So it's not the state deciding, it's not the private deciding, but it's actually organized collective entities. And with this, we have had many experiences. This is a project we developed with Cohabitation Strategies, which we're already working on new governance structures and so on for all of this. And so another very important part is that we have to acknowledge that there is money in the world today, and there's never been more money in the world today than it has ever been. Just last year during the pandemic time, there was more billionaires made than in the history of the world, of planet, right? Where is this money? And the imposition of austerity measures continue to be or to plague most urban environments around the world. We see there's no money, there's no nice highways, the pavements are all over the place, there's no money for doing this, there's no money for schools, there's no money for cultural centers. The austerity politics continues to be the way as money gets amassed in the hands of the very few. So part of the structure of Urban Front is that we have people that are very much working with finance mechanisms of redistribution or urban fiscal redistribution that should take precedence to support radical visions of massive reinvestment in the public and advocating for the politics of redistribution and the value of public good and for private profit. This is a group that we worked a lot with Cohabitation Strategies. What I'm showing here is the Right to the Sea Alliance. And they do all these tax the rich shuffles. They've been doing them from all the time, and they have a lot of fun doing them. But I think it's elementary that we discuss all of this. Now, neoliberalism relies on urban growth at the control of predatory speculative industries. These industries continuously transform our cities by coercing economic and fiscal incentives that favor profitable investment over social good. One of the things that need to be done is to develop alternative economic and financial models to prioritize social solidarity, collectivity, equality, community control, transparency, and environmental responsibility. And lastly, our 11th point here is that an access to adequate home is a right that every human should have. We think that home is not a commodity, and we're working to help cities take the production of housing out of control of predatory financiers and speculators. And this is one of the elemental tasks. how to design and develop non-speculative property systems, non-speculative property modalities. Our approach to the housing crisis has to be based on these limited equity housing models, land trust initiatives, the creation of commons, collective production, cooperative ownerships, economic emancipation, and democratic organization. So these are very abstract points that get me into one thing I want to present today as I start concluding, which is the question of unitary urbanism. Those of you that have followed the Situationists International from the 1950s, and specifically Gilabert, might have recognized this terminology. It was Gilabert that coined the term unitary urbanism. Gilabert sadly did not give us a lot of development on that terminology. It was taken by the Situationists in many other forms. But later, Henri Lefebvre and David Harvey brought it up as a very important aspect. And now we are taking it over as something that we want to discuss what should happen. So after years of experimentation with cohabitation strategies, it was a 2008 diagram that we did in cohabitation strategies, and this was a 2014 diagram. The key question of unitary urbanism has always been very present. We were always trying to think of a way in which to operate and to practice from a multiplicity of disciplinary perspectives, a multiplicity of actions. All of these 11 points that I presented were points that we were already thinking together as one. And it was only until I had the pleasure of helping David Harvey draw this diagram that you see here on the back, which was in 2019, we were in Oaxaca when we were drawing this, which was David Harvey's diagrams of conception of the capitalist totality. This is when everything started to click. The work that we were trying to do was trying to form a practice that operates in all the parts in which capitalism operates. In this case, in the realization of value in one form, in the reproduction of labor power, in the creation of production of space and nature, in the distribution of commodities, in the conditions of producing effective demand. Why? Because it is precisely this that produces the city. I have this thing that I say always in every lecture. The city is nothing but the most perfect mirror of capitalism. And if we want to work in the city, if we want to operate in urbanization, we must understand how this works. Because otherwise, we will never be effective. We will always just be working in one of these little points of the capitalist totality, ignoring every other little point. And this is the reasoning I want to bring here from the architecture world to architecture practice, which is, it's not that architecture is not important. It's that architecture is just one component of all of these components. Now, unitary urbanism is, for us, an anti-capitalist and transdisciplinary practice that attempts to bridge popular and scientific knowledge to co-produce social and environmental justice in cities. This is something that Gilabert did not define, that we are doing it So as we move on into our latest phase of development, this was the piece that we did for the closure of the Venice Biennial, well, for the last project of Cohabitation Strategies, which was at the Venice Biennial, which we did a piece that was called How to Begin Again, an Initiation Towards Unitary Urbanism. And in this piece, what we tried to do is come up with an agenda to visualize even further that diagram of the capitalist totality in urbanization, and where does architects stand and where do we have to fit in. This diagram is a final, not a final, but the current process of what we think is that capitalist totality. And I'm going to stand up. Can I stand up a little bit to explain this? If these three stages are the production of the urban environment, we have the global production of the urban commodities, the realization of value of urban commodities, which is where the kind of city that we see, and the distribution of surplus in urban commodities. We have to see the production of urbanization as this totality, right? A totality that emasculates itself first in capital, right? And later it goes to the state, And the state has other implications. So we here say that governance towards community control and municipal governance is very important. From capital all the way into merchant profit, the bankers, the financiers, and everything, the importance to develop new transnational solidarity networks of worker control, welfare towards placing health and communities at the care of urban futures. And from that point, we're talking about infrastructure spending, the production of culture, the production of welfare demands, the need to promote social density, the production of culture towards consciousness, radicalizing education and culture in that space, the infrastructure spending, which has to do a lot not with speculation anymore, but towards affordability and non-speculative patterns, the development of public space, spaces for leisure and interaction, the production of nature, as it is well discussed, state expenditures, the mobilities towards liberating cities for the fossil fuel industries, et cetera. And then all the way down into the spaces that we tend not to see, which is the places where most of the products of the city appear. Industrial profit, the free gifts of human nature, which is labor, the reproduction of labor power. And so infrastructures of our communitarian water supplies, energy and telecommunication, the distribution of the consumer demand, the boats, the ships, all the transportation networks that appear, the technological development, which is all the machinery towards eliminating distinctions between the rural and the urban, the means of production, the free gifts of nature, and so on. So overall, what we're basically telling all of you is that at the moment, architecture, and this is what I like more about this diagram that we did, is that the architect is actually this person represented. If you look at the diagram in life, it's huge. It's a very large diagram. It says here the architect. Right? The architect only occupies this space. And all of these actors have actually also a label that are occupied in the production of all these aspects of urbanization. So I guess that what we're trying to say is that, and this is abstract, capital, money, where is it? Where is those billions of dollars? This is abstract because we don't see it. But that any future practice of cities on urbanization has to be emasculated in this totality. And at least this is how we have been framing our work. Now, I still represent Cohabitation Strategies. Now I'm part of Urban Front. And Cities After is my podcast. If you think that all the babbling I made is actually worth it, I can promote the podcast of Cities After in Democracy at Work, which we talk the relationship of capitalism and urbanization. So this is my presentation, Unitary Urbanism. I hope I made sense. And I'm open to questions and moderation. Thank you very much.
Well, it is always.
Oh, yeah.
It is always a pleasure to, listen to some of the arguments that probably might not come as new. Actually, we have been discussing. Can I keep this or do I take it out?
Take it off. Take it off.
So, and yet, the range of provocations that obviously follow a tradition of rethinking the superstructure of the base, the relationships between citizens and society, is what we have heard is not new. It has been there latent for quite some time. And yet what I think for me today was interestingly and new from Friday, actually, when we talked, and I tried to convince Miguel to actually not come with a critique of the figure of the architect, but actually coming with an embracing of the figure of the architect, right? And yet what for me was very interesting about your argument today was when in fact you still a critique of the figure of the architect, right? You still started denouncing the figure of the star architect, but you also started making a critique of yourself, right? Of the bottom-up processes, of those ideas of collectivities, of the ways in which we have tried to make that critique without really engaging the structures of power. And ultimately, you find yourself at the end of your presentation, in fact, very close to those figures that you started criticizing, that you started actually
if you want, throwing under the bus of critique, mostly because ultimately you are going to find yourself working with politicians, working with the structures of power and capital, believe that in fact you can, as all those architects that you mentioned before, articulate the social, the political, the economic into a kind of collective aspiration through certain mechanisms. By architects usually is the idea of form, right? Is the idea of space, sometimes of urbanism and city making. In your case, seems to me, and this is, I will make one question and I will open it to the floor because I believe that there are many questions, is in your case, and correct me if I'm wrong, your tool is not form necessarily, but it is processes of redistribution, in which you ultimately, in fact, say that you wanted to redistribute some of the agencies that right now are concentrated within specific structures of power into new collectivities or into new forms. So I would literally just want to ask one question, that is, what is the tool that, in fact, your practice uses to materialize your architecture?
So also was super nice to, that's why I always like talking to you. I mean, it's a wonderful question. Like, I think that the way we see ourselves as urban practitioners, I emphasize the word of urban practitioner because I'm not saying architect specifically, because there are many people that practice in urban and the fields, but the way that we tend to see ourselves is that the discipline has a certain lack of temporality, meaning that architecture is eternal. I mean, we know those discourses that believe that architecture is autonomous. I mean, coming all back to time and so forth. We're not going to discuss all of that, but that architecture has its role and it's always will have its role and so on. Our viewpoint is no, that architecture, at least today, has, or in the 20th century and 21st century, has temporalities. And meaning that it served the argument that I started with, it served the purpose. I mean, like, if you have an agency of redistribution, in that case, which was a welfare state, right? And everything is put in place, and there's a belief that the welfare state will distribute the resources correctly, then the architect is a figure that matters at that point, right? The argument that we're trying to make right now is that it's not a figure that matters today. And I know that's very contentious to say in an architecture school, right? But it is that we must not see the disciplinary formations as static. And this is something that I guess we've learned on it. It's like we have to transform our practices, because ultimately you said a very beautiful definition on Friday about what architecture was. Something like that was very beautiful, right? Well, yes, if that is our case, then today, I'm sorry to say, but form is not the way. Form will not help us get there. Form would help the welfare state to produce many housing states and so forth. Today, there has to be other ways, because clearly, after 40 years of neoliberalism has shown us that it was actually the anti-way. It has totally destroyed most of our planet, right, in that way. So we are looking ourselves as subjects of a temporality. For cohabitation strategies, when we started, made sense because it was going against all of the top-down architecture facilities and or organizations. But after 10 years, after realizing this, it does not make sense, and we have to change to a different modality. We think right now that the most important project for all of us, if we want to change our cities, it's really infiltrating ourselves in the spaces of power and changing them, right? There is no other way to change our environment at this point, right? How are we going to do it? Well, we thought urban form is one of them, but I'm sure there are 20 other forms of doing it, but it is not through the making of a building. And so an architect has to accept that at some moments in history, those things can be actually quite futile and banal.
But I think everyone in this room would agree with you.
Yes.
I mean, we would have some people that might not, but we have Gary Bates, who's teaching here, who in fact presented a project not too long ago in which, he said that he himself is able to give and take, right, within a process, because ultimately the ultimate goal as an architect in the designing of a fragment of a city is to obviously act on behalf of an idea of society that sometimes the structures of political power are not necessarily acting for us. So, but I asked you about what were your tools, and you ended up making a critique of the architect again. That I know is an easy space of operation. But I said I wanted to ask a question, and I would give it to the ground. But let me ask you a second one, if you don't mind.
I love it.
You just made a critique of form, if you want, and we could extend it to aesthetics, and you say form is not the way, And yet, there are moments when we are all in a room in which we are able to hear a lecture and hear some thoughts, in which we have that moment of fantastic, abandonment of our temperature, and your skin starts getting goosebumps. We can have that experience with music. We can have that experience with space. We can have that experience with all kind of different forms of collectivity, of sensorial disruption, and so on and so forth. Of course, form carries, if you want, symbolic form that has politics embedded. Form has functional capacities. It is able to perform certain, specific functions. Form also has indexical capacities to perform things towards the future that we're able to identify. So I don't think that form per se is problematic. I think there are specific notions and ideas of form that are, but I do think that also as architects, or as chefs, or as many of the people that you presented in here, you made a critique of the expert, right? Mm-hmm. But you try to actually celebrate and glorify or recognize knowledge and people's knowledge, what I think is essential. And so in a certain way, the idea that architects, in fact, one of our expertise, one of our knowledge areas is form. Shouldn't we celebrate that knowledge, right? And the idea that, in fact, we are able and we need to understand the symbolic and value formations all throughout history that form has produced to produce new ones, to produce new moments of aesthetic. The unitary urbanism was also an aesthetic project, was highly an aesthetic project, where form took a front row, right? I put myself like red socks. Why? Because I knew he would be actually wearing red socks. So, you cannot be talking about form or color or aesthetics, because we do know that they carry a major power in the definition of how we actually work and live together. So my question still goes in asking, what are your tools, and why that kind of so radical critique of form, when in fact I think that form is another knowledge space.
I'm sorry I didn't answer that first one, but yes, one of the tools without doubt, we're seeking redistribution mechanisms, but we're also seeking to, blur the disciplinary lines and disciplinary backgrounds. Let me put a perspective. When I arrived to New York City, I think we talked about this on Friday. I was asked to design a new graduate program for the new school on urbanism, right? I had already the wonderful chance of doing that in Europe, in Switzerland, and in the Netherlands. And the whole experience was always working to reach what should the school look like? I mean, I think that's where I'm going to head my answer to. And most of the times when you're talking to an architecture school, 70-80% of the curriculum has to do with the technical learning of how to do the form, right? And the argument that I just made is that, why is that? Because there's no reconstruction of how the education, I mean, I guess it's equated to what we learn, right? And I'm not arguing that any architecture school shouldn't do that, because then we enter into the space which I entered with discussion with the Swiss. With the Swiss were like, I was great with the Swiss, but it was hard because they see the architectural discipline as a technical aspect where the architect does not get involved in politics, right? You just produce your building the best you can. At least the people I've met there, right? And therefore, yes, they produce wonderful, like absolutely beautiful, stunning, super well crafted buildings. They actually laugh at the craft of the Germans, just to put it that way, right? Amazing work. However, if we see architecture at that space, then it's fine. The issue is that we are training technicians, or are we training people that are able to actually think of how to transform the disaster that we're in? And this is where I get into the question where, well, then the curriculum should change. Then every aspect on how we see the work that we do. And I know it's very hard, because if you ask a professor that's been doing this for 40 years, and he's like, well, guess what? We have to, it won't happen. When we started the program at the new school, we had to put it outside of the architecture school because the architects wanted it to look like something, especially urban design from the 1980s Harvard or 50s or 60s, right? And so the only way that we could actually structure a new school was to get it out of the architecture world, right? We have 20% of architects or less applying in the program, or less. The rest are from all kinds of disciplinary apparatuses. So I guess what I'm trying to push is the need to restructure how we teach urbanization in the future, in not the segmented aspects that we teach it now, the fragmented right? All these little people, like everywhere flying, each of them in this own little fragment, but the composition of capital and how we produce urbanization is very different, right? So I guess, I'm not sure if I answered that, but this is where I'm heading. I mean, the discussion, but it's like, it's a lot to think about, yeah.
No, I mean, and I think that you're obviously, and the reflection and part of what I'm very much focused on these days is understanding the curriculum, what is it that we should be teaching to address some of the urgent features that we have to confront, and where and how, what would one introduce ideas of, politics, economy, or many of the different knowledge areas that you actually bring into your 11-point manifesto. Do you introduce that at the end of your studies, at the beginning of your studies? Are they part of the base? No, are there? And that's complicated. But I mean, I would love another.
Later on, I'll ask a Swiss to speak for himself. But before I get there, I want to ask you, does the production of new collectivities guarantee transparency, equity, and a range of issues that you enumerate? Now, the reason I ask this, of course, is that in the last half a decade, we've seen the exposure and reemergence of a vast new set of collectivities, which are very focused on eliminating those very transparencies. And so, I'm simply speaking that the right wing has developed its own tools and mechanisms. I'm going back to the question of tools, and I'm not going to tout Trump as a systemic thinker, but the chaotic and unsystematic way in which it formed new collectivities was also a shock to many. And so I'm trying to also get more into your thinking about systems of governance in relationship to all of the other disciplinary tools that come not just with form, but actually the organizational mechanisms that architecture produces, the structures that it produces, and relationships it produces. And I think it's somehow embedded behind what you're saying, and they are deeply political, but I'm just trying to make sure that I don't misunderstand you also, because I also don't know, I don't see right now from the perspective that we're looking at the world, that collectivities will in and of themselves guarantee the equities that you're after.
Yeah, I mean, one of the most beautiful sort of experiences that I've had growing up to the side or being mentored by someone like David Harvey has been to learn a lot about the issue that contradictions play in capitalism, right? Like, and the obsession of Karl Marx on contradictions. He always saw capitalism as a system full of contradictions. You know, one thing appears and then the other, and there's contradicting changes and so on. Now, with that in mind, I'm going to give you a very interesting example of exactly what you're saying. Like about 2017, it was when Habitat 3 happened in Ecuador, of all the places we were there. And we helped structure the parallel habitat. I don't know if you were aware that there's like a social habitat conference that gets organized by a group of international activists always in every habitat. And we were like helping structure that and so on. And then one of the visits that we paid was in Guayaquil. Habitat was happening in Quito. So to go to Guayaquil, you have to take a plane because it's very complicated to do it by car. We arrived in Guayaquil and we're going to do work with collectives in a site that developers were trying to dispossess. And the whole point was to make a big conference there to support that international people coming so that the developers didn't take that land away or so on. So it's an action, right? And so we arrived there, you know, we land in Guayaquil, they bring us to this place, and then these wonderful people picked us up, and the people were wonderful. We went to this area, we started to have our lectures, our conversations, we had police because the bulldozers were waiting. It was like a big scandal there, but we were like, yes, we're supporting these people and doing it. As we go to having dinner, we start to discuss with this collective, right? And to my surprise, this is I guess where you're heading for. To my big surprise, it turned out that the people we were helping, or not helping, supporting in their cause, right? were all Christian evangelists that were being dispossessed of their own land, right? Now, from my politics, I mean, like, I can tell everyone publicly, I'm not a Christian evangelist. I consider myself a Satanist, if that's the case. I don't subscribe at all to that, right? As a matter of fact, 99.9% of what the ideology of that brings. However, our positionality on the contradiction has to be very clear. We're not there to enter into the smaller ideologies that are produced by capital. We are there as clear anti-capitalists, and our anti-capitalist agenda was to support the coercion of the bigger powers over the non-bigger powers. And whether they were Christian evangelists or whether they were Satanists or whether they were there, that was like a secondary thing of our task there. And so I agree, you have to have a very clear, and this is one example of so many I can give you, where it's like, oh my God, who are we supporting? What kind of collectivities am I subjecting? As long as we have as clear as possible the anti-capitalist objective, I think that starts to clear away. And those contradictions, this is why I started, continue to appear. We will be working with all these kinds of people, right? And it's contentious. But nevertheless, we believe that the anti-capitalist agenda trumps, not saying that, the other. I don't know if that kind of answers it, but yeah.
I mean, I think it opens a wide range of questions about, is that enough? And is the anti-capitalist agenda enough to then enable some of those collectivities that might, being a woman, understanding that there are plenty of anti-capitalist collectives around the world that would put me and, in your fire pit. So I don't think that, I mean, there is a moment of weakness in there, but for me it was very interesting. I was just writing, like, what does a diverse collectivity mean? How does one impose? This idea of like the anti-gerrymandering, the hyper-diversity, the constitution of hyper-diverse collectives. Would that be something that would follow the principles of enlightenment and equality into a next step? And one of the things that maybe, I was looking to your work, and it's very much grounded. Every single image tries to portray a phase, a personal reality. And the word speculation is always seen next to the, like financial speculation. And yet I do believe that sometimes, the speculative thinking, the idea of trying to envision societies, if you want positive utopianism, I'm very interested in saying, how does one, trigger conversations of design, of new collective aspirations from the constituencies of those groups and those collectivities to the new forms, or like new forms of assembly, or new forms of like ownership, or new forms of understanding those gifts from nature. How do we then move forward? To me, as an architect and as a designer, I'm very interested in the tools and the methods in which then we can help the students or also ourselves to then sit down and say, where do we start designing? And maybe one of the things to design is to design collectivities. The other one to design is to design new laws. No? And so this is to be like the kind of tangible aspect, or the design of new aesthetics is to me of essence.
Yes. Very fast. I mean, like in the new school, I'm in Parsons School of Design, right? And I don't consider myself an architect anymore. And I love saying that I don't know exactly what I am now, and I think that's part of the uncertainty. But one thing that they argue a lot there, there's like a contentious argument between the NSSR, which is a New School of Social Research, which is a famous sort of Hannah Arendt type of space, and us as Parsons. And there's like a contentious argument there because, you are designers, you look at beautiful things or whatever, and then we are the thinkers. I actually think that a designer is anyone that dares to imagine a different outcome. And so every single student that arrives to our program in Parsons, most of them anthropologists, artists, geographers, we have doctors even in our program and so on, they're designers because they have an intention of transforming the reality, the material reality. That for me is like the most beautiful definition of what a designer is. And therefore that has to be, it's not only the one that knows the Photoshop, which they want to learn the Photoshop, and it's quite an issue. But that's, I think that's why I feel comfortable being in a design program, because we're trying to,
Thanks for a very, very nice and inspiring talk. Just because I'm Swiss, I could understand. I very much can feel what your feelings were when you were confronted with this, and to a large extent, I also subscribed your analysis. I also was in Venice in 2008, and this was probably a reaction of many people. This is all irrelevant, highly irrelevant, what is on display here. At the same time, I'm more skeptical about dividing things, taking things apart. Sometimes it helps to make the point, but I believe that form is highly political. At the same time, think that form is just one of the tools of the architect. And if I look at the start of your talk, where you talk about the star architect mechanism that is already history, doesn't exist anymore. What is good, and probably it has been just the most disgusting, appearance of a certain phenomenon, but just the tip of an iceberg. Because if I'm honest, I must say the same mechanisms are still in place at a much less, visible or scale. It's a state of the profession, because we are considered, and we consider ourselves as service providers of services that get more and more narrow. Form, the idea of form becomes negative if it's superficial. If it's a form that doesn't include many things, politics, and but it's maybe just facade design at the end. And star architects were very much about these phenomena. There, my point is, but I'm not sure. I think it's always problematic to blame to somebody else for a state of things. So neo-capitalism, of course, hasn't been helpful. But on the other end, I think there is a big part of responsibility of us to the profession, of the schools, because we retired, we gave up basically. We don't care about the techniques behind. We don't know how things are done. We don't know about the bigger picture, the mechanisms. There, probably the fact that we are not considered valuable anymore, and we're just good, I'm exaggerating, to do a nice facade to represent neoliberalism. It's maybe not the fault of neoliberalism, but it's ourselves. And so if you wanted to repair, to fix this, then we have to find out how to include all these things that maybe it is a bit romantic at some point were part of the profession into our proposal again. And then eventually we become valuable again and we get more control on the whole mechanisms.
Yeah, it's very complicated. What you're saying, I don't know why I was thinking very directly of another major influence I've had, which is, because of the context where I started with Teddy Cruz, for example. There are believe me, very, very few architectural practices that I admire, and that because they're trying to do something which is not to accept, and what Teddy always said in his lectures is like the idea that architects are decorators of power, right? That their only purpose is that, right? So if the purpose is not to decorate power, then what purpose does it have in the neoliberal times, right? And I think practices like him, even though he still is an architect, I was talking to him yesterday, as a matter of fact, he gave me that image. And he was telling me that, I started building, to finally demonstrate that, everything I've done. I mean, he's been showing us images for 20, 30 years, right? About his work in San Isidro in the border of Tijuana and so on. Those of you that know his work, he's doing a lot of very interesting work. But he still wants to be an architect. And he still is very excited that he's finally building what he had imagined 20 years ago, right? But what we have to consider is that what made it possible for 20 years to pass until he actually managed to build the building. And it's admirable that he did all of that work of the 20, 30 years to be able to build that, whatever is that, to the point, to my view, that the building doesn't matter anymore as much as all the processes, financial, governance, mechanisms that he had to put together in order to assemble this. Similar as these friends from Colombia, from Arquitectura Expandida, it's another practice that I admire a lot, where they do self-construction with people in the barrios in Colombia, right? And they, yes, they produce a building. but the building becomes kind of like the excuse to create collectives, constructions, other kinds of things. So they're starting to use the knowledge, a specific knowledge of the architect, which I think we all should accept exists, right, as a medium, right, to emasculate yourself into all of these other dynamics, right? It is not the principle itself, even though the Arquitectura Expandida crowd produced, I like their buildings. I mean, Viviana show me this, they're fantastic, the buildings, but it is not the buildings that actually stay, it's the process that they create in order to do that. And so I think there are examples, but sadly, there are a few of them, right? We can talk many of them, but there's still a dominant discourse. Look at the architecture schools that continue to emphasize that other part that you mentioned. So yes, I think in contemporary times, form could be political, but if it's embedded with all of the political forces that were needed to produce the form itself, right? So in the case of Teddy Cruz building, his built form represents all of the political aspects he had to do, to actually make that form possible. Whether that will remain, we don't know, because the organization could change, and that's a different discussion. But yeah, it is possible. But you see, it's the medium. It's kind of like the Brechtian idea that says, like, the people that do theater, if they know how to do theater well, and if they're aware of those things that they need to do, they will become political by definition, because theater in itself won't be the importance, right? It will be everything that gets discussed in the process of making the theater. Benjamin also said the same. The idea that we use what we know what to do as a medium, right, could be the interesting part, but yeah.
I think it's a lot about power structure, because, for example, understanding how you build something, or being able to build it yourself or with a community, it is knowledge. This is very, very powerful knowledge that is able to shift, this balances. But this is about boldness. So first you have to, as a profession, we have to understand that if you don't get powerful, we will not be relevant in any way. Maybe we do it all right. Maybe we can solve a certain specific sub-problem, probably an irrelevant one in the big picture, in a fantastic way. What you were talking about, the Swiss architecture, or we are bold enough to claim certain, spaces, power spaces for us, in order then to instrumentalize them towards,
I guess that will never convince you, or anything. It's not my sense to convince, but I guess what I'm trying to say from this lecture is it's daring to explore other things and acknowledging that the other things might be more important than what we already know what to do. Basically, that the other things are as important as players as the production of urbanization, the production of our built environments, the production of building collectives, and that we need to explore those spaces much more than we start to become more specialized in what we tend to do, right? Which is precisely the form or the space or the public space or whatever. I think there's a need to dare to completely restructure what it means to be educated in 2021 with global warming, with all the political turmoil that we have, with all of these things, what it means to be studying architecture today. And I don't think that has been asked very seriously. And it has to do with giving away a lot of the tools that we thought that were important, right, to other issues. But yeah.
Elizabeth, just No, you.
Thank you so much for the talk. I think it's great to be speaking this way at a School of Architecture, and I was struck in many of your beautiful diagrams, but one of them, the large ones that you showed at the end, when there are many, many people, many objects, many machines, many devices, and the architect and the building is a small thing, and you talk about the small role in a huge ecosystem. And so I thought that was pretty powerful, because we also have to accept that there are many people that are fully invested in this system, like it or not. There are all those other people who are invested in this neoliberal system and are not yet ready to resist and call for large change. I also thought that a beautiful thing that you said was that the city is the perfect mirror of the social order that sets it in motion, or it is the perfect mirror. So we are now living, the chickens are coming home to roost. We are living with the thing that we have intentionally made. So is it even possible for our small profession to take on the city as an entity, or might it be more practical and productive for us in our own education to take on a smaller institution, which is the university? So you taking on Parsons, like, what are the structures there? What are the structures of labor and capital and exchange and commodification? And how do we begin to really actively change an institution that can trickle, like, I guess we start our own trickle up process?
Yeah, it's a beautiful question. Thank you. I think I'm going to tell another anecdote. Before the pandemic, when I used to travel a bit more, I mean, I was in Venice, not in a biennial, just invited to give a talk there at the university there. And there were a bunch of people there, especially professors there, that were listening and asking a lot of questions. And then one person in the room got super mad at me because, I mean, I'm not saying that I repeated these, but I basically said, like, look, architecture is not working the way you are teaching it. And this person said, how can you, excuse me, how can you say that, Miguel, if architects are the experts of form of the city, right? Their architecture is the one that understands the city more, literally told me this, right? And by then, I've already was out of the architecture world in many ways. I was working with a lot of geographers. I was working with a lot of anthropologists, economists, artists. I've been doing a lot of work with artists. And I say, like, how can you even think of that, right? And say it in a public setting that your discipline is the only way or the best way to look at the world. First thing we need to learn is that relationality, right? That aspect that, like, actually, yes, that we're like this little figure in all of that, right? And that by being this little figure, the best way to act, according to me, is to join other figures. Not do that like separation where the architects only talk to the architects and they only understand each other and they only look against each other. And that happens with every discipline, by the way. When I go to a geographer's conference, I mean, it's geographers talking about the supremacy of geography and then architects talking about the supremacy of architects, right? And you can go disciplinary apparatus after disciplinary apparatus. And actually it was Lefebvre, the first one that said in the late 60s, it's like, this is insanity, right? Like, you have all these disciplines thinking they're the best way to look at the world, rather than looking at forms of merging these things, into larger bodies of knowledge. I have a limit. I'm not able to work around all these diagram spaces, but I'm working with people that are this little person there, this other one, this one there, where we are able to create a mesh of knowledge that is greater than my own. And I think that is like a very important shift that needs to happen, right? That we really don't, I mean, like, the discipline in itself, yes, is that, I should have put it even smaller, is that insignificant, right? In the picture of things, right? But it is not insignificant once it starts to relate and join and network with others, right? And I think that is perhaps the most important part of an architecture school to teach, right? At this point, if you want to be technical, or any school with disciplinary lens, it's like, yes, I mean, you have a specific kind of knowledge. Let's agree. I knew how to draw. That's why, I made some diagrams. But, okay, fine, right? But there are other sort of aspects that one needs to learn and open ourselves, or forms of knowledge, especially street knowledge. That's very important. Yeah.
One more question.
I have just a quick question. Do you think Teddy Cruz's work, even during the past 20 years, that before getting to the building as an excuse, has a degree of tectonic, even aesthetic assertion that made it important, and it was involved with a whole range of things that was not about aesthetic at all, but it has a kind of asserted, way of, in a way, look. And that was an important one. And I think goes back to your students, that they can come from any of the disciplines, but the moment that they want to transform something, there's also that desire, but also the assertion that this is the thing. And I think that's the moment that the discipline gets formed. And it can be a negation of all of our other aesthetics. And at the moment that you assert both the desire and that, claim for a certain way that things are done, that becomes the form of knowledge that we produce. So it's, I think both the current lines of discipline might be misleading to contain ourselves with, and also the profession definitely is a misleading one, because that immediately is already in the hand of capitalism. But that moment of assertion of even negation of a form or building as an excuse, you have to not only put it as a thing, you have to call it, call its expression as a form of, as a deliberate decision. I think that's a moment sorry.
You encounter all of these things, like for architects, perhaps that aesthetic decision matters. To my mom, it doesn't matter, right? I mean, she might like it and might not like it. So that's also something that we have to acknowledge. There are certain moments of decision, certain moments within disciplinary apparatuses that matter within, our interests, right? And the expressions, the aesthetic expressions. Teddy, I mean, I know him since he was not known. I mean, in many ways, right? He phenomenology and he at certain point when I met him, admired Stephen Hall. He might be watching right now, so and be careful. But it's true. I mean, he had like books of Stephen Hall, like phenomenology, these drawings. He learned how to draw. He was an artist. I can trace sort of the aesthetic sort of like development that entered into what Teddy Cruz ended up producing in his moment of decision, of aesthetic decision. But that is something that is very internal to the aspects of what we do. Right now, there are many external faces, which I think right now gather much more importance, right?
I don't mean his own artistic contribution. I'm saying that the moment that he was looking at Tijuana's grassroots ways of putting things together as a building, there is a radical moment that is not just coming from pure desire of aesthetics, or it comes from looking at something and claiming it as a form of expression. I think there's a decision, it's a different than artistic. And I think that's a radical one. And I think that's the moment you account for that is the core of our discipline. So it's aesthetic, I'm using aesthetic just to make it charged, but it's not different than getting influenced by authors.
That's super radical. I lived in Tijuana for many years. And until I met Teddy, which was when I was 19 years old. 19 years old. I saw the border. And imagine, I lived in the border with that wall in front of me all the time, and I never saw it. I mean, it was there, but it was through that moment of representation. I agree. I mean, there's a lot of influence. It's a different way of looking at things, right? But I don't think it's only architects. I think actually a lot of artists do it much better, right? And therefore, yeah.
I mean, I think it's obvious for many of us today is that you obviously have also showed us some walls, right? And I have had the pleasure to discover new walls that we have in front of us. And the task here is obviously to understand how do we put them down and how do we mediate them. I think Elizabeth's question about in which scale can we start testing some of those projects that the Urban Front might want to take in the future, if it is within a classroom or a university, or if it is within a city or a country, or ultimately we take this small planet called Earth that ultimately is asking global questions of like substantial urgency. I think it's something that probably will come to us 10 years when you will show us the work that you have been doing and the work that you are going to be doing. But I just somehow what I said on Friday is something I've been saying for a long time. I think the architect as a figure has the privilege, but ultimately the responsibility to articulate the social, the political, the environmental, the economic in a project of collective aspiration.
That was your definition.
Yeah. And I think that if you take that one, I hope that the next time you can start by saying, we as architects, star architects or not, trying better and succeeding less, good and bad, because there are all of those. We're all in this together. And I think that that's what is amazing of having you here. And it was a real pleasure. So please join me thanking Miguel Robles.